I wanted to start with a personal anecdote. In 1982, I was working as an editorial writer for the Guardian newspaper. At that time, I became extremely concerned about what I considered to be the double standards of the paper's reporting. At the time, believe it or not, Syria was murdering large numbers of its citizens. I think it went through about 20 or 30,000 fatalities in the course of about a week in 1982. Same old story. This event, these atrocities in Syria were attracting very, very small amount of attention. A few paragraphs on the foreign pages buried in the middle of the newspaper. Whereas Israel's actions towards against the Palestinians, at that time Lebanon was very much the issue of the day. If Israel killed 3 Arabs, it was a front page splash story, there was an angry editorial, there were furious columns, letters, etc. So I said to my colleagues in the editorial conference, which wrote the editorials for the paper, I said, in all innocence, because I hadn't quite understood at that stage what I now understand to be the case, I said, why is there a double standard? And they looked at me as if I was crazy. And they said, of course there's a double standard. You don't expect us to judge the third world by our standards, do you? In the West, we are brought up to believe in human rights, in respect for other people's lives, for life and liberty. They don't. They don't have these cultural assumptions in the third world. So it would be racism for us to judge them by our standards. And I said to them, so you're telling me that if one is born into the third world, one does not have the same expectations of life and liberty as people in the West? Isn't that racism? And they said, don't talk to us in that tone. You people purport to be more superior than us. And that was the beginning of my path down the road to infamy, by which I realized that the kind of values that I had assumed to be the case on the progressive side of the political divide were not progressive at all. It was my introduction to the left's idea of anti-racism. It was my introduction to the idea that universal human rights, strangely, are not so universal at all. So please bear that anecdote in mind as I pursue my remarks to you today. This is St James's Church in Piccadilly. Piccadilly, as you may know, is in the very centre of London. St James's Church, until this Christmas, was a completely ordinary church of no particular interest to anybody. But for 8 months, they plotted to do what was done over Christmas as their Christmas spectacular. This is a wall. It took them a very long time to assemble, and it is supposed to be a replica of the apartheid wall around Bethlehem. And people were invited to write on it appropriate messages. And they wrote hateful messages. Some people wrote, "This wall saves lives," in desperation. But that wall was up for many, many days, and that's what people saw. That was the advertisement in the centre of London about Israel at Christmas time, that Israel was committing human rights atrocities against the Palestinians. And there was a week of events. It was called Bethlehem Unwrapped, and it was a week of events to tell people precisely how iniquitous Israel was. That's what happened in London over Christmas. And then, subsequently, as you will know, that's what happened. And we all cheered up a lot as Scarlett Johansson told Oxfam to go and stick its famine relief and its appalling boycott ideas and resigned as its ambassador. And this was much cheerier, of course, for all of us, as for the first time, as far as I can recall, a personality took onto the front foot the defence of Israel and became very well known as a result. But nevertheless, it also drew attention to the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, a movement which promulgates not just distortions about Israel, but is a political program whose end, if you study the BDS values, its end would be the end of Israel altogether. So we have a very strange situation. in which we have universities, churches, trade unions pressing continuously for boycotts against Israel on the grounds that it is a serial human rights abuser against the Palestinian Arabs. Recently, of course, in this country, you had the ASA trying to do the same thing. Now, the individual boycotts may be beaten back. In fact, they are being beaten back. And, you know, we can have a discussion about the BDS movement, about whether or not it's actually doing any serious harm to Israel. At the moment, it's not, in terms of actual economic boycotts. The sting of the boycott movement, it goes beyond whether the individual boycotts actually succeed or not, because first of all, informal boycotts, certainly in Britain, are taking place all the time in academia or the arts. Individuals, Israelis, find that they don't get on, they don't get invited to various places and so on. There's enormous pressure on entertainers who go to Israel to perform. In Britain, university students are marked down if they don't reflect the narrative of Palestinian oppression by Israel. It's axiomatic in Britain that Israel is the principal human rights abuser in the world. If you are an Israeli who has been involved in military action of one kind or another, you are, or until very recently, you were likely to be arrested. A citizen's arrest could be made by human rights lawyers for your serial human rights abuses. The British government got so worried about this, even the British government got so worried about this, it changed the law to try to stop this from happening, but the law doesn't actually, it's not actually very safe. The law has been constructed in a way which has loopholes, so the British government is still very concerned that if Israelis who've been involved in military action step off that plane, they may still be arrested. Nobody else is arrested. If you're a Syrian stepping off a plane, you don't get arrested. If you're a Russian, if you are an Iranian, you don't get arrested. If you're an Israeli, you get arrested. In demonstrations against American foreign policy or Israel, there is this stunning fact that so-called liberals, so-called progressives, are marching side by side in protest against Israel, against American foreign policy, alongside those who do not support rights for women, rights for gay people, rights for unbelievers. They actually stand for killing them or jailing them or oppressing them. And yet British Western progressives and liberals are marching side by side under the banner of human rights with these people. Is that not strange? There is also this global army of NGOs committed to human rights, committed to demonizing Israel. This is very largely made possible by the European Union, which is a very major vehicle for this kind of political pressure, since the European Union funds these organizations to the tune of several million euros. And all the time, actual human rights abusers get a completely free pass. Syria had to murder tens of thousands of people before anyone took much notice of that. No one tries to boycott China or Iran. The protests at the Sochi Olympics haven't actually materialized as far as I can see. No one's actually made a protest, but insofar as there was going to be a protest, it was about gay rights. Now, gay rights is one thing, but there was no mention of dissidents or journalists being locked up or murdered in Russia. No one really cares very much. The only thing they care about is Israel. Israel is the one upholder of human rights in the entire region. Israel is the one country which is singled out for pariah status as a serial abuser of human rights in the world. And Israel has become the cause of causes for progressives, certainly in Britain. So this is surreal, is it not? How has Israel got itself on the wrong side of the human rights argument of all things? Why is it being singled out as the principal human rights abuser when it is the principal upholder of human rights? Now, some of it is prejudice and some of it is ignorance, and some of it goes back into history. We all know about the history of European countries and their attitudes towards Jews, the history of Britain in its attitudes towards Jews. But I would suggest that to find the explanation, we need to go rather deeper, because it's not just a weapon of war against Israel. This whole sort of human rights inversion is not just acting against Israel. Human rights culture, human rights law has become a weapon of the culture war in the West, and very much so in Britain. In other words, human rights more generally has gone very wrong. Human rights has become a principal weapon of injustice. Now, in Britain, there is a paradox. Britain is the home of the BDS movement, and Britain, you could say, is also the home of human rights law. But human rights in Britain has now got a really bad name. Amongst ordinary people, there is fury at human rights culture and human rights law. Nothing to do with Israel. But people in Britain believe that human rights law has become synonymous with eroding their own security and the whole notion of citizenship by giving minorities a free pass against the majority and undermining the security of the country. And this is because judicial rulings under human rights law, both in Britain and the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, have made Britain a soft touch over the years for radicals seeking a hospitable birth. Judges in Britain effectively tore up British border controls by making it impossible to police illegal immigrant claimants through an elaborate system of hearings and appeals. Any attempt to thwart welfare benefits to illegal immigrants was thwarted, to stop welfare benefits to illegal immigrants was thwarted by the judges. And above all, the judges prevent the deportation of those who are thought to be a danger to the state if they are to be returned to countries where they might be ill-treated. They can't be deported, and they can't be neither can they be locked up, because that also would be an infringement of their human rights. Why? Because we only lock up foreign terrorists in Britain, not homegrown ones, and therefore it is discrimination. This is all beyond surreal, but this has been the case for many years, and the result has been, so to quote the title of my previous book, Londonistan, the result has been the creation of Londonistan, a situation where foreign radicals flock to London from where they continue to organise and export extremism and terror. One judge, one very senior judge, Lord Hoffman, in one of these cases, which said you can't deport foreign terrorist suspects because this is discriminatory and breaches their human rights, he declared that Muslim extremism did not threaten the life of the British nation. He said, the real threat to the life of the nation, in the sense of a people living in accordance with its traditional laws and political values, comes not from terrorism, but from laws such as these. In other words, terrorism wasn't the problem, it was the breach of human rights, which was the real threat to British life and limb. This is crazy stuff. Now, this has all grown in Britain over the past 30 years or so, as primacy of human rights law, and that's gone hand in hand with the increasing ambit of European human rights law. The European Court of Human Rights judges in Strasbourg have progressively widened their scope as part of the growing ideological belief in universal legal principles trumping the law of individual countries. Now, this movement in increasing human rights law in Europe in turn encouraged the English judges to flex their muscles in new directions. During much of the period when Mrs. Thatcher was in power, I think it was 13 years she was in power, the Labour Party appeared next to its demise. That wasn't the case, but it was pretty moribund, and there was no political opposition to the Thatcher government. And the judges during that period decided that they should become the opposition. They decided it was their duty to rescue democracy by effectively becoming the opposition through their human rights rulings. They saw themselves as the last redoubt of democracy fighting an overmighty executive, and so they began to challenge government policy more and more through the increasing use of judicial review, especially over asylum and immigration cases, and began to think of themselves, of judges, as in a much more political way. When the Labour government came to power in 1997, it entrenched judicial activism by incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights into English law. And this brought human rights law very much to the forefront. It galvanized special interest groups to make demands of the state on the basis that these were rights enshrined in law. It created a burgeoning industry of human rights lawyers and effectively transferred much political power from Parliament to the courts. And all this culminated in the farce, you may have read of this, of the farce of deporting Abu Qatada to Jordan. Abu Qatada is a major al-Qaeda figure. He was the major recruiter, funder, spiritual guide to al-Qaeda in Europe. He was based in Britain, and it took 12 years to get him out. Why? Because of fears that if he was returned to Jordan, which wanted to extradite him, the fears were not that he would be ill-treated in Jordan. The fears were that in his trial, evidence would be used which had been gained by the Jordanians in the past from ill treatment. That took 12 years and more than £1 million of public money to get him out to Jordan. And that kind of thing has driven people completely mad. Also, the fact that human rights, far from being universal, are seen to be denying some people human rights by giving other people human rights. And the last straw for the British public is that the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has said that prisoners should be given the vote as a matter of their human rights. And the British public has just gone into orbit about all this. British government is under great pressure. It says it's going to do such things, rather like King Lear, I will do such things, but no one quite knows what the things are. But it's promising to basically stop this human rights, this human rights culture from becoming so powerful. So a certain amount of buyer's remorse. Nevertheless, in Britain, there's this perception that human rights has eroded democracy, and that's true in my view, but I believe that this misses the deeper point which I want to come on to, because it's not just that it has eroded democracy in Britain. The human rights culture comes out of a view which actually erodes democracy in itself, because human rights culture is a weapon of war, both a culture war and a war against Israel. We can see this very clearly at the United Nations. The United Nations supposedly embodies the idea this is a world body committed to global peace and justice. And yet, as we know, the UN Human Rights Council, and before that the UN Commission on Human Rights, absolute farce dominated by serial human rights abusers. And this is because the UN itself is dominated by tyrannies which cynically use the language of Western human rights to defeat the West. It's used to protect themselves against any criticism of their own abuses. So much is plain to see, but the question we have to ask is, how are they allowed to get away with it? Why does the world stand back and basically just sort of ignore this complete travesty of human rights going on at the UN? And the answer is, as I've tried to suggest already, that the concept of human rights itself has gone very, very badly wrong. It has been hijacked and through international law has been turned into a vehicle for injustice, because these are not fundamental human rights at all, but a highly contingent formula designed for groups to exercise power over other groups. And so, far from protecting Western civilization, human rights has turned into its potential nemesis. So how did this happen? Well, human rights has basically changed its colour very dramatically. Human rights law was drafted in the wake of the Second World War with the most noble of intentions. It was designed to lay down a set of principles to ensure that totalitarianism would never deface Europe again. In the shadow of fascism and Stalinism, its original aim was to protect the individual from the state. So a set of rights was codified as the International Convention on Human Rights, later the European Convention on Human Rights. But this is a very English perspective I'm about to give you. The very act of codifying these values, these rights, into a declaration, into a convention, in my view, changed them radically, because codification, when you actually set something down, actually limits and constrains liberty. The most traditional form of liberty, in my view, is to be found in the English common law. The English common law basically says everything is permitted unless there is a law against it. The problem with codifying human rights is that only what is laid down is permitted. And so codifying human rights moves from negative to positive liberty. You may be familiar with this concept described by Isaiah Berlin, that negative liberty, the freedom from something, is true liberty. That was English common law. Positive liberty, the freedom to do something, actually paves the path to tyranny, because it prevents what's not laid down from being considered to be liberty. It makes what is not permitted potentially forbidden, and it gives power to individuals, known as judges, to arbitrate, to say what is permitted, what is forbidden. And so universal human rights makes a completely false claim to universal values. These are not universal at all. They are highly contingent on political or ideological choices made by judges. In the Convention on Human Rights, almost every right is balanced against another right. Free speech against privacy, family life versus security, So one person's rights diminishes the rights of another set of people, and it's judges who decide where that balance should be. It also detaches human rights, I think, from the crucial context which gives true fundamental human rights their meaning, because human rights come from something which is laid down actually in the Hebrew Bible. It is a concept of duty. It is duties which create our rights. Our right to life comes, for example, from the prohibition against murder. Without duty, rights become something different. Without duty, rights become basically wants, then they become entitlements, then wants that have become entitlements become demands, and then, as a result, the demands inevitably become politicized. And so it was that human rights became a vehicle for imposing controls over behaviour, a vehicle, moreover, uniquely well placed to be used to advance what then happened in the West, led, I would suggest, by Britain. And what then happened was culture change. This culture of the West, led by Britain, has changed by basically taking an axe to the very concept of duty towards others. The emergence of a culture of hyper-individualism, me first, hyper-individualism, gave rise to a radical egalitarianism of lifestyle and values. Everyone had the same moral, everyone's lifestyle was deemed to have the same moral value. No one could be judgmental about anyone's values or lifestyle. And so morality was privatized, and all constraints of religion, tradition, or cultural taboos became seen as an attack on personal autonomy. Now, this fundamentally changed the relationship between the individual and the state, because where previously ties of obligation, of duty, bound individuals to each other and to the state, the new culture of entitlement imposed instead an obligation on the state to deliver individual demands presented as rights. And since radical egalitarianism, the sameness of lifestyle choice, meant all lifestyles had to be seen to be of equal value, the very notion of a majority culture, a culture which said we uphold certain norms from which there are transgressions which we disapprove of, the very notion of a majority culture in this new climate of everything is equal, or normative rules of behaviour, became seen as innately wrong, exclusive, prejudiced, oppressive. Moral judgments between different lifestyles or behaviour became discrimination. Prejudice, the term for discrimination between lifestyles, became the sin that basically hit at the moral codes at the very heart of Judaism and Christianity. Instead, all minorities became the victim class to be championed. Wants became entitlements, entitlements became rights. Human rights law became a way of overturning majority values. Indeed, a very senior judge in Britain, Lord Bingham, said in terms that the Human Rights Convention, which existed to protect vulnerable minorities who were sometimes disliked, resented, or despised, was an intrinsically counter-majoritarian movement. It was no surprise, therefore, he said, that decisions which vindicated minority rights should, quote, provoke howls of criticism by politicians and the mass media. They generally reflect majority opinion. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that minorities should have no rights, but what I'm describing is a vehicle, human rights law, which was innately disposed to prioritize minorities over the majority, regardless of the merits of the case. And so human rights doctrine became the cultural weapon, the principal weapon to undermine fundamental values of Western society, with an activist judiciary turned into effectively cultural warriors marching behind the banner of militant secularism. As the human rights activist Francesca Klug boasted in her book Values for a Godless Age, human rights, she said, are now probably as significant as the Bible has been in shaping modern Western values. So what was this shaping? Well, the nation itself became suspect, since the nation was the embodiment of a majority identity, which by definition treated minorities as lower in the cultural hierarchy. So the idea of a nation which represents and protects individual citizens on the basis that they all subscribe equally to a set of overarching identity and values became replaced as the key political driver by interest groups defined by race, religion, ethnicity, gender, or other existential categories. And so the values of the dominant culture had to be replaced by the perspectives of these self-designated victim groups. And thus democracy became effectively redefined from majority rule among equal citizens to power sharing among ethnic and other interest groups. Multiculturalism became the orthodoxy of the day, along with non-judgmentalism and lifestyle choice. The only taboos now were the expression of normative majority values, such as monogamy, heterosexuality, Christianity, or Britishness. You couldn't and cannot uphold these things without being accused of bigotry of one kind or another. Because they were rooted in the particular, they were by definition discriminatory. The only legitimate values were now universal, detached from particulars such as religion, tradition, or nation. So the nation itself came to be seen as past its sell-by date, an anachronism responsible for all the ills of the world, such as racism, prejudice, and war. The remedy to the nation was what John Fonte termed transnational progressivism, the idea that we must all sign up to, what we all must sign up to, crosses national boundaries. And thus democracy itself, the expression of a particular culture through a particular set of laws, through a particular parliament or lawmaking body, democracy itself began to die. Laws based on the values, traditions, and histories of particular nation-states had to be replaced by laws and delivery mechanisms that are universal. So international law trumps the political decisions of sovereign states, and values are imposed by supranational institutions such as the European Court of Human Rights, the European Union, the United Nations, or the International Criminal Court, which are increasingly becoming the sole sources of legitimacy. Indeed, law itself now trumps other forms of human interaction, such as, at one end of the spectrum, informal relationships based on custom or convention, and at the other end, defending liberty through war. Instead, the view took hold that the application of law would settle all the world's problems and conflicts. It was law that, by regulating behavior and attitudes, would bring about a new and uplifted universal psyche, codifying principles to which all civilized people could sign up, would, it was thought, eradicate hatred, impose global order, and remove any occasion for war. Now, the real game changer, I would suggest, in all of this was the fall of communism. What I'm describing preceded the fall of communism. This transnational progressivism movement was well in train before communism fell. But communism falling, which of course took many years, it didn't just fall when the Berlin Wall fell. Everyone on the progressive side could see that, Soviet communism had it for years before then. But very significant changes came with the fall of communism. First of all, it ended the idea that there was a balance of terror, the idea of nuclear deterrence. It basically meant that people became less frightened of war. They didn't think that anymore they were going to be incinerated by a nuclear bomb because the Soviet Union had collapsed. It introduced globalization, the blurring of national boundaries. And the really important thing that happened in terms of attitudes was this, that with the fall of communism, the conservative part of the political divide, and the right, the political right, felt it had basically shot its fox. It had no more socialist fox to shoot. And the left felt that it had no socialist charger to ride. It had no socialist ideals anymore. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The two sides became sort of interchangeable. Both left and right now all supported the market. The left, therefore, needed a new utopian project. It had to find a new radical motif that would enable it to continue its defining mission to transform both society and human nature. And so the left turned its attention to far less visible and more slow-burning ideas to do with the culture war, family, education, multiculturalism at home, anti-colonialism and anti-racism abroad. Humanitarianism became the norm. The watchwords were end oppression, end world poverty, don't kill anyone anywhere. Human rights law became a vehicle for these causes and a great cause in itself. Professor Conor Gearty, a prominent British human rights lawyer, said after the fall of communism, "It was around this time, in the mid-1990s, that people began to notice that the little human rights tent which had survived on no man's land for so long during the great ideological wars just past was still there, with the same ethically impressive, dedicated people hanging around determined to do good. To the old socialists who couldn't bear to become full capitalists, this looked now like a very attractive place to be, human rights, that is. To profit makers who wanted some kind of human faith, it also seemed ideal. Enough ethics to dilute capitalism with humanity, but not enough to threaten an unwanted revolution. Then came the horrors of Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and a recovery of the old idea which had fueled the immediate post-war period of why human rights really mattered. The tent grew and grew in size as it accommodated more and more people determined to assert that the market was not the only show in town." Thus, the rise of anti-colonialism, support for third world liberation movements. Those liberation movements could do no wrong, because the rule is this: if you have power under this thinking, this progressive thinking, if you have power as a person, as a group, as a nation, if you have power, you cannot be a victim, and you cannot do right. If you have no power, if you are a minority, or women who have no power, as we all know, or a third world country which has no power, you can do no wrong. That's how it goes. And that was enshrined in progressive culture and given a vehicle to impose it through human rights law, which was now a world cause of causes. And as a result, another thing happened. Law now replaced war, because human rights was a way of saying that never again would the world be engulfed by war, as there was now a legal instrument to remove the circumstances leading to the slaughter of civilians. War was replaced by law. There was no longer a threat from Soviet nukes, and in Britain there is now an almost pretty well, I would say, pretty well entrenched refusal ever to go to war again in the national interest. You can only go to war for humanitarian reasons. If people in Bosnia are being slaughtered, if people in Syria are being slaughtered, then you might go to war, but never to defend the national interest, because the national interest is the West. The West is not a victim. The West is not threatened, therefore, by anybody. And so the West never goes to war in its own defense. Instead, negotiation is seen as the universal paradigm. The collapse of apartheid in South Africa is put down to reconciliation and the peace process. The peace in Northern Ireland is put down to the peace process. Today's terrorist is tomorrow's statesman, while, of course, today's statesman is, in fact, today's terrorist. In fact, this is an entirely wrong analysis. South African apartheid was not brought down by negotiation. It was brought down by the fall of communism. Other things too, but the fall of communism was very, very important in this. Peace in Northern Ireland was not brought about by the negotiation process, the peace process which brought in the IRA. The IRA only came into the peace process after it was effectively militarily defeated by the British Army. So the idea that, you can't make peace in the Middle East unless you bring in the Hamas and the Hezbollah and so on is based on a completely false premise. But then again, here's another wrinkle about human rights culture and progressive thinking today, because there is no distinction made between aggression and defense. All that matters is the body count, because this is a consequentialist universe. What people do, their motives, doesn't matter anymore, because you mustn't judge. So morality goes out the window. What matters is the end product, dead people. Doesn't matter how those people died. Doesn't matter whether they're the result of aggressive terrorism or the defense against aggressive terrorism. Dead people are no good, especially if those dead people are from the defense of a strong country. Britain, America, Israel, in which case those dead people are effectively murdered by Britain, Israel, or America. The dead people really murdered by the Hamas, by the Fatah, by the Hezbollah, by Al-Qaeda, those people aren't really murdered at all, because those movements are to a certain extent resistance movements. They must be, because they are the expression of minority groups who are powerless, because they are minority, they are nations that are powerless. They are third world people. Go back to my experience in The Guardian. They have a completely different conception of human rights. They can't do wrong by our standards. And this is where you can see where my logic is taking me. This all points to the perfect storm, which is Israel. Because you see, to a certain extent, the progressive side had a cause until Nelson Mandela came to power in South Africa. Its cause was apartheid, and it channeled all its energies into that. And then Mandela won, and apartheid went, and what now was going to be the cause of causes? Israel. Israel is the apartheid state. Israel is committing genocide. These things are madness. But by the logic I've just described, Israel fits the bill several times over. Israel, first of all, is a nation. Bad. Israel is a Western nation. Very bad. Israel is a racist Western nation. Why? Because Israel is the home of the Jewish people, and that's racist. That means that other people don't have rights. Yes? No. But that's how it works. And then Israeli military defense is illegitimate, because we all know the only way to solve a problem, a conflict, is through negotiation. So it's obvious Israel must give and compromise and speak, and the Hamas must be involved. And that's obvious. So when Israel sends in the bombers into Gaza to stop the thousands of rockets coming over, no one even cares about the thousands of rockets. It's never even reported in Britain. What matters is the dead Palestinian babies, who of course aren't dead at all. Many of them, this is Pallywood, it is false, but nevertheless, that's what matters. It's the body count among the poor Arabs, because they cannot do wrong and Israel cannot do right. And so one of the other factors in this is that this doctrine that law replaces war leads directly to lies and injustice, because, you see, nothing can be allowed to derail the peace process. And this kind of explains the kind of whole madness that we're seeing now with Kerry and the peace process and this absurdity. Because we saw this in Britain with Northern Ireland. The peace process is sacrosanct. Therefore, you cannot admit to stuff that will really derail the peace process, like the fact that the IRA won't give up its weapons, like the fact that the Palestinian Authority, forget Hamas, the Palestinian Authority won't agree to accept Israel as a Jewish state. You can't even think about that, because that will mean the peace process comes to an end. And then what? Then you might have war. But war is always wrong, always wrong. And so the peace process, the idea that law replaces war, leads directly to lies and injustice. Any possible obstacle has to be airbrushed out of the picture. So Abbas and the PA's incitement, their refusal to recognize Jewish Israel, the fabrication of history, not to mention their active sponsorship of terrorism, none of it earns any kind of rebuke. Israel is accused of being the obstacle to peace by building new homes for Jews in disputed territories. And so this is how Israel has become the perfect storm in terms of human rights law. It is in an impossible situation because it ticks all the boxes of why human rights law has inverted truth and justice, and why Israel literally can never redeem itself. And the answers to this, the solution to this is, of course, very complex. I personally believe the solution has to start with telling a few home truths about what the actual situation is in Israel and the Middle East and the lies that are being told. And I personally think one can actually make a lot of inroads by doing that. But in order to understand, in order to address this problem, one has to understand the problem itself. And the problem is much deeper than simply some extraordinarily perverse, incomprehensible animus against Israel, which people look at in its own terms. Yes, it is extraordinarily perverse. It is almost impossible to believe that the lies that are being told because they are, anyone who says Israel's committing genocide only has to look at, the Palestinian population increasing by, 4-5-fold more since Israel was created. So it's very hard to take this on board, but one has to understand that it's related to a broader, I would call, madness, by which I mean an inversion of the whole notion of truth and lies, right and wrong, which is to do with the way a culture has turned bad and turned against itself, which is encapsulated by and given the weapon of Western human rights law. Thank you. The lady in the front row has said that human rights may be legitimating or legitimizing anti-Semitism because Jews are seen as powerful. And I think this is absolutely correct. The culture, certainly I was going to say in Britain, but it's also in America too. I'm thinking of Professors Walt and Mearsheimer, who expounded this doctrine in their appalling book, The Israel Lobby. This idea that the Jews are uniquely powerful in the world as a lobby group, as having power over American foreign policy, so that the Jews have this kind of cosmic power to derail the foreign policy of the most important country in the world. And that the Jews also control the levers of a culture. They control finance, they control the law, they control the media. This is a very, very common assumption. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that it goes back in its essentials to antiquity, this idea that the Jews are all-powerful, when of course the Jews are in conventional terms, extremely weak and powerless. But we have in Britain, I'm not sure whether you have quite this situation in America. As I say, you've got Walt and Mearsheimer, which have done terrible damage. But in Britain, we have a situation now where people say these things and don't get knocked back. That's the really terrible thing. So, for example, the former Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, Labour Foreign Secretary, has said now twice, once last year and once this year, he's referred to the power of the Jewish lobby in respect of Iran, that the reason why there is no agreement with Iran is because Benjamin Netanyahu embodies the extraordinary power of the Jewish lobby to basically get their claws into American lawmakers on Capitol Hill and basically frustrate the President of the United States. This is a former former British Foreign Secretary, and that the Jews have this financial power. Is basically what he said. Now, there was a time, when I was young, when that sort of talk would have been confined to the far right and would have been considered absolutely objectionable. Absolutely objectionable. And now it appears quite frequently, and everybody goes, oh, really? Yeah, okay. That's it. That's it. It's quite extraordinary. So I wouldn't say, there's a direct link between, human rights law and anti-Semitism, but the fact is, self-evidently, in a culture which is obsessed by human rights, it's also presiding over the expression of old-fashioned anti-Jewish hatred of a kind that we all thought or hoped had been driven underground forever until fairly recently. And these things are not unconnected. So on replacement theology, I have, as a gentleman suggests, written about this a great deal. And this replacement theology, sometimes known as supersessionism, is basically a Christian calumny against the Jews, which has come roaring back into mainstream Christian thinking in the Anglican Church and in your progressive churches. Replacement theology is the old doctrine that goes back to the early church fathers, which basically said that because the Jews denied the divinity of Christ, they forfeited all the promises, they forfeited the love of God, and all the promises made by God to the Jews were therefore given to the Christians. The Jews, therefore, by forfeiting the love of God, were in league with the devil. Now, that replacement theology doctrine lay behind centuries of Christian persecution of the Jews in Europe. It went underground with the Holocaust for obvious reasons, as all prejudice against the Jews went underground with the Holocaust, or the discovery of the Holocaust, I should say. And it's come roaring back in the last 15 years, maybe more, through Palestinian liberation theology. Based in the Sabeel Center in eastern Jerusalem. These are Palestinian Christians who have fused this ancient doctrine that I've just been talking about with Palestinianism, so that Jesus becomes a Palestinian. As we heard Mahmoud Abbas say recently, Jesus was a Palestinian. So all the sort of suffering of the Christians, or the suffering of Jesus, is transferred to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the people to whom God's promises have been transferred. The Palestinians are the people who are therefore the legitimate inheritors of the land of Israel. That's basically how it works. And for complex reasons to do with personal communication between the Sabile Centre and the Church of England's hierarchy, and the fact that progressive Anglican thinkers or progressive Anglican clerics have bought into liberation theology, the oppression of the Third World in general as the cause of their cause of causes. That's kind of hoovered up, as it were, the Palestinian issue. This theological stuff has become fused with their desire to relieve the suffering of the poor Palestinians in their oppression by Israel. It's therefore got a theological tinge, and that also in Britain that has done untold damage, because unlike in America, Britain is now quite an irreligious country. Very few people go to church, but if you are a vicar, if you are a bishop of the Church of England and you go on the radio and you say, you know, suffering Palestinians, people listen and they believe it, because since you are a bishop of the Church of England, you're telling the truth. You're a man of God. Even though you don't believe in God, men of God tell the truth, whereas politicians, especially Israeli politicians, don't. And so the impact of the Church of England's and the progressive churches in this country, the impact of this belief is unconscionable, and the churches have been in the forefront of trying to bring about boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel as a result. The lady asks about Britain's attitude, opposition to the human rights law, and how it is manifesting itself and whether it's going to change anything. It's manifesting itself simply by people jumping up and down and members of parliament understanding that their constituents are enraged by this, and thus the government is under pressure to do something. Now, my view is that the government promises to do something are worthless. The government says, we are going to go to the European Court and we're going to say we're not going to take much notice of this or that element of human rights law. My understanding is that's not possible. You sign up through treaty for the whole shebang. If you don't like it, you have to de-sign. You can't have a little bit. But it's a matter of opinion, but that's what I believe to be the case. And so, the end of the day, I think that the government of the day is going to basically not deliver on its promises via the vague promises to the people, who are going to become more enraged as a result. The problem is the British people, by and large, do not see that as having any connection to the treatment of Israel. They put that in a completely different box. And your other question, how does Israel combat all this, since people won't listen to the human rights, since people are so obsessed by human rights? Very simply, Israel has got to start, well, Israel does not do itself any favours in the way that it handles what I would call this psychological warfare, because it's basically absented itself from this particular battlefield. But it would be quite simple, although it would take a tremendous amount of organisation and resources. It's quite simple to turn it, because Israel has a compelling story about human rights. Israel is on the side of not just human rights in day-to-day terms, but international law. People in Britain believe that Israel is a serial international law abuser. Right? It believes that, for example, the Israelis have stolen the land from the Palestinians. What people in Britain don't know, what many Israelis don't know, is that Israel stands on very firm legal foundations in its occupation of the disputed territories and in its settlements policy. You can go back to 1922, you can go back to 1967, you can go back to all kinds of statutory instruments to show that it basically stands on international law. And as for human rights, it can easily show that, you know, Israel is the one country in the Middle East where there is freedom of worship for Christians. It's the one country in the Middle East where gay Palestinians flock for refuge, and so on. It can make a compelling case which would actually accord with people's views in Britain. They're not necessarily bad people. They do believe in human rights. They do believe in justice. They do believe in law. They do believe that people should not be oppressed. The problem is they've got it completely back to front about who is doing the oppressing and who is doing the illegality. So it's quite simple intellectually to turn it round. In my view, what the human rights law has enabled judges to do, what they've done without thinking about it really, is to completely undermine the whole notion of citizenship. I mean, citizenship to me is basically, again, it's a matter of duties, not rights. Citizenship is not a matter of rights. It's a matter of duties. When you are a citizen, you undertake certain duties to the country. You undertake to uphold the laws of the country. In particular, you undertake a set of obligations in which you basically affirm your membership of a shared group, which is the nation. The gentleman has asked why Israel won't do what it needs to do to combat this madness because it's hung up on the two-state solution. Why doesn't it do what it needs to do? Well, I mean, this is very complicated argument. The first thing to say is that it doesn't. It has not taken seriously the psychological war being waged against it. It's understandable. It's preoccupied by actual military warfare. It's a society which is very heavily, I was going to say militarized. That's giving a slightly wrong impression. But, the physical defense of the country is so overwhelmingly important that the political echelon actually does not have a strategic approach to anything. It has a military approach. I mean, its politicians are very often, old soldiers or of great distinction, and they think it's like a military campaign. They have no civil strategic view about the nation and where it's going. They simply have to survive physically, and so you have an entirely dysfunctional government. Dysfunction in all kinds of ways. First of all, there's no strategy, no strategic thinking, and secondly, it's what my late mother would have called a typical Yiddish business. Everyone is at each other's throats. There is no coherence to it. There is no discipline. There is no collective endeavour. Every minister fights every other minister for money, for power, for prestige. It's chaos. You have to treat it as a highly dysfunctional child who will never, ever be able to operate as an adult. That's the political reality of Israel. It makes it very, very difficult. That's the first answer. The second answer is that they got hung up on the two-state solution in Oslo. And they made a turning which many people support and many people still support it. But that's the turning they made, and it's very hard for them to get out of it because people like me come along and say, why don't you start telling people the truth? Because if Israel, unless Israel tells people the truth, people like me and even this great organization here of the Lawfare Project, we're all kind of trying to do this with two hands bound behind our backs. People can come along to me or the Lawfare Project and say, you're just a vested interest group. You're just an individual warmongering Zionist journalist. Israel isn't saying these things. And so the ground is taken from under our feet. Now, why won't they say it? So I've said to them in the past, why won't you say, for example, there is nothing illegal about the occupation of the territories or the settlements? Why don't you say that if there's any illegality, it was on the part of Britain, which repudiated its own international treaty obligation to settle the Jews in, guess what? Not just what is currently Israel, but also Judea and Samaria. Not that I'm necessarily saying they should hang on to it all, but if you want to talk about international law and justice, why don't you start telling them that? Because people don't know this. And other stuff like that. I say, why don't you tell people the truth? To which the answer is, you want us to upset our allies? To which I say, you think Britain's an ally? And they say, you think it's not, compared with the others? And so we go around in a circle. And then that's before you get to America. Now, for many years, they used to say to me, who cares about Britain? What it did in Palestine in the Mandate was beyond thinking. Who cares about Europe? The European graveyard of the Jewish people. Why should we ever, ever spend any time on them? They will never, ever take seriously what we're saying. They will never, ever be on our side. It's fine because we have America. It's fine because we have America. But they never had America. America has gone like that over the years. The American people, another matter. Vast numbers of American Christians, highly Zionistic. But in terms of American presidents or American governments, it's a very patchy record, and that's before you get to today, right? And so now they are where they are. Now they are where they are. You have to ask yourself, you may know about the Levy report. The Levy report said there is a cast iron international legal basis for the settlements, right? Levy report published. What does the Israeli government do? Does it say, here is a report that shows that we're right? It's silent. Why is it silent? Because of Obama. Because Netanyahu will not upset Obama. Why will he not upset Obama? One reason. Every single thing Netanyahu has done in the last 6 years in terms of America has been because he's trying to get Obama to commit himself to the fight against Iran. Everything else has been subordinate to that. And now he is where he is. Well, so this lady saying Arlene Kushner is getting out the Levy report. It's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is it's important. It would be a dramatic change in the international temperature if the Prime Minister of Israel were to say, look, here's a report. This is true. You're all wrong. We are entirely legal. Very important for the Prime Minister of Israel to say that. He doesn't. He doesn't. And as a result, we're all literally fighting with two hands tied behind our backs. Okay? Zeu? Okay, thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.